All right. Hi, guys. So we are now in World War II, and one of the big things that certainly made the United States the most formidable power in World War II was the production, the ability to produce. And even Japan was aware of that. And some people say the reason they wanted to attack Pearl Harbor was to deal a sort of knockout blow immediately because they knew that if the United States stayed in the war, eventually their production would just become so massive that production alone would win the war with simple numbers of tanks and planes and things. Now, the United States did and still does have a tremendous advantage of being relatively isolated from the physical impact of the war at home. So we were not being bombed. Now, of course, Pearl Harbor, obviously, that was an attack on home, and there were the Aleutian Islands and the Alaska Island chain. So there were some very minor um, conflicts there. But for the vast majority of the war, at least on our physical continental parts of the United States, and of course Hawaii wasn't technically a state then, but that's another story. We were not being impacted by the war, and so we were really able to focus exclusively on wartime production. And Japan, on the other hand, an island nation, obviously short on natural resources, they were severely limited in what it could produce for the war effort. And, raw materials such as, iron, which you turn to steel, rubber, these kind of things are very, very important for the war effort. Now, Germany, on the other hand, was a very efficient, productive society and was already producing massive amounts of equipment. But their production, even their production, could not keep up with the strength of American factories once the factories got going. Now, of course, when war was declared, it took a while in order to get our factories, completely geared up in order to produce wartime goods. And, Roosevelt did say, and it is true, the USA would win the war on the production front. We're just going to have so many more weapons, and they're going to be good quality that no one's going to be able to keep up with what it is that we can produce. Building on this, the focus to a wartime production led a shift away from producing consumer goods. So now we were seeing a much higher emphasis on war related goods and less production on consumer goods. So, for example, automobile plants built tanks and airplanes instead of cars. Now, this doesn't mean that you could not buy a car. There still were cars available, but much, much, much fewer amount of cars. And instead, these factories were now building airplanes, tanks, and other war-related vehicles. Dress factories, other clothing factories sewed military uniforms. Other factories produced ammunition. And this complete change of the American production, American economy, required a need for whoops, sorry about that, managing the massive amount of resources that were necessary for such a massive production. And what happened was eventually the War Production Board was created, and this was responsible for allocating resources and coordinating production among the thousands of factories. And this is similar like they had in World War One. Let's just make sure that the necessary raw materials get to the factories that are producing the goods for the war effort. That is more important. Now, how do you convince people or companies and business owners say, "Hey, you should shift from making typewriters to ammunition, or making dresses to uniforms"? How was the government able to convince these private businesses? Remember, these are private businesses. They can produce pretty much whatever they want, as long as it's legal, of course. Well, the government actually had American companies eager to shift production. And some of the reasons were, well, patriotism, but also the U.S. provided financial incentives. It was what's called production plus. Production plus meant that that factories were guaranteed a fixed profit. The cost of production plus a fixed percent of profit. Now, it wasn't going to be like 90% profit. It would be a small profit margin, but this sort of took any sort of guesswork out of it. Say, look, the more we produce, the more money we'll make End of story. It's not a matter of we learned before how supply and demand tends to rule the economic world in the United States. It's not, well, we produce too many tanks, then we won't get paid as much because the value of the tank will drop. That was not the case. The government said whatever you produce, we will buy, and you're guaranteed a profit. Now, again, we're not talking, a huge, huge, huge profit, 8%, something like that, 5 to 8%, something like that. But again, this combined with patriotism was a real motivating factor for companies to switch to wartime production. And you're talking about, well, what exactly solved the Great Depression? Remember last chapter, and we're looking at, well, was it the war or was it the New Deal? Well, this is where people make the argument that increased war production helped bring back the demand for products, which led the USA, at least assisted the coming out of the Great Depression. But they said one of the, I guess, negatives would be because only very large companies could meet the demands for these, thousands of products. Most of the wartime production went to large companies, and you said that's a good or bad thing, but during wartime, we got to get what needs to be produced needs to be produced. Well, life on the home front, what did people who did not go overseas to fight, what remained of their life? And believe it or not, and again, coming out of the Great Depression, life for Americans was actually improved as a result of the war. Now, it's obviously true, families are going to be very concerned about, their loved ones, being injured or killed. That was always going to be a major, major concern. My grandfather was in World War II, and I know that my grandmother was always concerned and worried about that. And it's totally natural. But it's also true that Americans started to enjoy a newfound prosperity, meaning wealth, or not necessarily like wealth, like you're so rich, but you're doing well. And a lot of it was brought on by the war production. Americans, well, they were also to a large degree insulated from the direct contact with the horrors of war. Death, famine, rape, destruction, murder. I mean, all these horrible, horrible things that were going on, because it was over there, in Europe and in Asia, and it didn't, directly affect the United States, or so people thought. Well, very much like, unlike recent military conflicts, I should say, Americans actively supported the war effort. There wasn't this big, well, I don't know. And again, I'm not saying it's good or bad to support or not support the war effort. That's an individual decision that you have to make. But the fact is, the vast, vast, vast majority of the American public did support entry into World War II after we were bombed at Pearl Harbor. Before that, it was a sort of lukewarm proposition. But as an example of some of the support, we had 20 million victory gardens were planted. Housewives did things like returning cooking fat to the butcher because fat was used to make glycerin, which apparently is used for gunpowder, I guess. I mean, I'm not an expert on that. Even kids, children collected scrap metal for these scrap metal drives, and they even had posters. One old shovel can provide enough iron to make 4 hand grenades, and this was a real motivation. You could actually see the tangible effects of what you were doing. We also had rationing, and there's a picture of that on the next page. Things like fashions even were redesigned to save wool. Fashions were redesigned to free up more material for the war effort. Women's stockings were no longer made, so the silk could be used and nylon could be used for parachutes. So this is to the extent to which the society changed. Even men's suits, they had less buttons on them. They were not as long as they used to be. So all these sorts of things, and believe it or not, that actually ends up going to turn into a riot with the Zoot Suit riots, where people wore intentionally long clothes to sort of protest the war effort. Well, finally, for today, the Office of Price Administration created a rationing system. And you can see some of these ration booklets down here. These are examples of ration booklets. A point system was created, and every ration item was worth a specific number of points. Each person received a red and a blue rationing booklet. Things like canned fruits and vegetables were in the blue category. And things like meat, fish, dairy were in the red category. And you were given stamps, and you had to manage, stamps, and ration your own consumption of these sorts of goods. And remember, this was not a time where they had these massive stores like Vaughn's and Costco and things like that. You had to go to the butcher to get meat. You had to go to the milkman to get milk and eggs and things like that. So you didn't just go into Vaughn's and be anonymous with all the other hundreds and hundreds of people. People actually knew. And was there cheating on it? Sure. There's always black market and cheating for things like that, but for the most part, it was effective. Now, again, even though support for the war was almost unanimous, some government officials worried that support for the war might wane or lessen over the time as people become frustrated with the sacrifices. So in 1942, created the OWI, the Office of War Information, and they were responsible for selling the war. And this means that the Office of War Information had to convince people to support the war through propaganda. Now, again, most people supported it. But it wasn't just like, let's get you to support, yes, I'm for it. Let's actually get you to change your behavior. And of course, various types of propaganda were used. But you can see, for example, this piece of propaganda tries to convince you not to waste gas, to carpool, to save the limited resource of fuel and have more available for the war effort, and all sorts of types of propaganda, and some that we would not probably use today anymore due to its language, such as this poster, right here. So that is it for today. But thank you so much for listening.